येस, करूयात सुरुवात. नमस्कार. सावित्रीबाई फुले पुणे विद्यापीठाचे माननीय कुलगुरू प्राध्यापक नितीन करमळकर सर, ऑक्सफर्ड विद्यापीठाच्या सेंटर फॉर ओरिएंटल अँड आफ्रिकन स्टडीजच्या प्राध्यापक रोझलिंडो हॅनलन, सामाजिक शास्त्रांच्या आंतरप्रणाली अभ्यास केंद्राच्या प्रमुख प्राध्यापक राजेश्वरी देशपांडे आणि इथे उपस्थित सर्व सहकारी आणि मित्र हो, आपल्या सर्वांचं मनापासून स्वागत करते. आज आपल्या सर्वांसाठी अतिशय आनंदाचा दिवस आहे, अभिमानाचा दिवस आहे, कारण या ऑनलाईन वर्गाच्या माध्यमामधून महात्मा फुल्यांच्या स्वप्नामध्ये जो एक एकमय लोक होता त्याचा एक छोटासा कवडसा आपल्याला अनुभवता येतो. 950 वर्षांचा इतिहास असणाऱ्या ऑक्सफर्ड विद्यापीठामधल्या प्राध्यापक रोझलिंडो हॅनलन या भारतीय उपखंडाच्या आणि खास करून महाराष्ट्राच्या अभ्यासक म्हणून जगभरामध्ये प्रसिद्ध आहेत. त्यांनी आपल्या विभागासोबत विद्यापीठासोबत अध्यापन करायला होकार देणं ही फार मोलाची गोष्ट आहे. 1 तासाचं व्याख्यान आणि नंतर तासभर विद्यार्थ्यांसोबत प्रश्नोत्तर असा अद्वितीय अनुभव आपल्या साधारणतः 100 विद्यार्थ्यांना हा आठवडाभर रोज मिळतो. आमच्या इतिहास विभागामधल्या केनियामधून आलेल्या पॅट्रिशिया पासून ते महाराष्ट्राच्या विविध भागांमधून आलेल्या कृष्णा, ओम, प्रार्थना अशा वेगवेगळ्या जगांमधून आलेले विद्यार्थी या अभ्यासक्रमामध्ये सहभागी झाले. भारतामधल्या किमान 5 राज्यांमधून आलेले विविध विद्यापीठांमधले नबीला, हर्षिता यांच्यासारखे विद्यार्थी इथे आहेत. अमेरिकेमध्ये डॉक्टर आंबेडकर जिथं शिकले त्या कोलंबिया विद्यापीठामध्ये शिकणारी रोहिणी इथे आहे. हाँगकाँग मधल्या विद्यापीठात प्राध्यापक असणारे धारूरकर सर इथे विद्यार्थ्याच्या भूमिकेमध्ये. अकॅडमिक नेटवर्क म्हणजे अभ्यासकांनी एकमेकांच्या सोबत गुंतवून घेणं हे जे एक उद्दिष्ट आम्ही हा अभ्यासक्रम सुरू करताना मनात ठेवून माननीय कुलगुरू सरांकडे कल्पना मांडली ते इथे प्रत्यक्षात आलेलं दिसतंय असं म्हणायला काही हरकत नाही. आंतरप्रणाली केंद्राच्या प्रमुख प्राध्यापक राजेश्वरी मॅडमने ही कल्पना सरांसमोर मांडली आणि सरांनी तिला लगेच पाठबळ दिलं. सर, तुमच्या पाठिंब्याशिवाय हे शक्य नव्हतं. संशोधकीय शिस्त आणि नैतिकता पाळून केलेल्या प्रत्येक कामाला माननीय कुलगुरू नितीन करमळकर सरांचं आम्हाला नेहमीच पाठबळ असतं हे मी माझ्या अनुभवामधून सांगू शकते. तुम्ही तुमच्या कामात सगळी संशोधकीय नैतिकतेची पथ्य पाळली आहेत ना, मग कुणी काही म्हणू दे, तुम्ही काळजी करू नका, लिहित राहा, अशा शब्दांमध्ये सरांनी मला जे पाठबळ दिलेलं आहे ते कधी विसरणं शक्य नाही. त्यामुळे मग कुणी किती सांगितलं की आपण सत्योत्तर जगामध्ये राहतो, इथे अभ्यासाला, संशोधकीय शिस्तीला या व्हॉट्सअप विद्यापीठामध्ये काही मान्यता नाही, तरी सावित्रीबाई फुले पुणे विद्यापीठाचा आमच्या सर्व संशोधकीय प्रयत्नांना भक्कम पाठिंबा असतो हे इथे नमूद करायला मला अतिशय आनंद होतो. अगदी परवा शिवजयंतीला आगा खान पॅलेसमध्ये एका व्याख्यानासाठी गेले होते. तिथे आर्किओलॉजिकल सर्वे ऑफ इंडियाचे पश्चिम विभागीय संचालक आले होते. त्यांनी देखील आपल्या विद्यापीठाच्या विविध उपक्रमांचं, खास करून माननीय कुलगुरूंच्या कल्पनेतून 4 वर्षांपूर्वी आम्ही जो हेरिटेज वॉक साकारला त्या कल्पनेचं फार कौतुक केलं. इतिहास आणि वर्तमानाची गळाभेट घडवताना असे वेगवेगळे उपक्रम सरांच्या पाठबळाने नेहमीच उभे करायला आम्हाला आनंद होत आलेला. आज या कार्यक्रमाच्या निमित्ताने आपण माननीय कुलगुरूंचं मनोगत ऐकायला जमलो. या अभ्यासक्रमाबद्दलची आपली भूमिका आणि हेतू याबद्दलचं प्रास्ताविक प्राध्यापक राजेश्वरी देशपांडे मॅडम यांनी करावं अशी मी त्यांना विनंती करते. अनम्यूट मॅडम.
Thank you, Professor Kumbojkar. And once again, I welcome Professor Karmalkar, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, to this valedictory program of the course, online course on approaches to history and literature, which is conducted by Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon. I also welcome once again Professor O'Hanlon. And as we discussed on the very first day of this week, this has been a very enjoyable week for all these students who have joined the course from across the various parts of the world. And it has also been a very enjoyable, empowering kind of exercise for us, the faculty at the Savitribai Phule Pune University. And as Shraddha mentioned, all this was possible, especially because of the support and the courtesy of the Vice Chancellor And therefore, I'm really grateful to him and the university for allowing us to conduct this kind of a course. The cue to this course, the key idea was about academic networking, as Shraddha mentioned. And so we thought that we will have this course as on the lines of Gyan, the program that was initiated earlier by the government of India a few years ago. And it was discontinued or it was suspended for a while for various reasons. And that led us into thinking that we should continue with the exercise of academic networking, because that has been a very important aspect of learning, especially as far as social sciences are concerned. And especially with the emphasis of interdisciplinarity, the idea of interdisciplinarity that has now become a kind of buzzword for the new education policy and in our entire higher educational discourse. But we were also aware that the social sciences, especially of Savitribai Phule Pune University, have always been practicing interdisciplinarity in all their studies since long back. So we thought that we should continue this endeavor of academic networking and sharing of knowledge. And the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, which we are very privileged to have in our university. Very few state level universities would have this kind of a platform. So we are privileged to have this platform of Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in our university. And we thought that we should make the best use of such platforms. This was the beginning of the idea of this course. And fortunately, the university has allowed us very graciously to use some of its resources for the conduct of this course. So it was a very welcome move on part of the university. So what the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies has planned as its mandate is to conduct 2 such courses during the current academic financial year. One is the ongoing course led by Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon, and we have also planned another course led by Professor Balamurali Natarajan, who's going to speak on issues related to caste in contemporary context in the month of March. Apart from these 2 courses, our exercises of academic networking and sharing of knowledge also continue with many new initiatives of this Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, in which all my colleagues, including Professor Kumbhodkar and many others in social sciences, have been contributing. We have started a faculty speak program, and this I would definitely like to share this with Honorable Vice Chancellor. But we have started a faculty speak program where our own research is presented for the research students, for the benefit of research students and other colleagues, so that there should be a very healthy interaction and transparency in the entire research exercise. We have started a group of research students, discussion group of research students in social sciences, and also following the spirit of establishment of the School of Social Sciences in our university, we thought that such kind of an interaction, academic interaction also across the disciplines within social sciences would be helpful. And in a somewhat novel kind of initiative, we have also extended for the very first time a research grant to the MA students during this pandemic period, where we expected them to do a small research of their choice while they are not able to come to the campus. And I'm glad to inform again all of you that we will be soon holding an offline in-person conference of these MA students where they would present their research. So all in all, the idea is to develop this very healthy interaction among the various disciplines of social sciences, and also to take this interaction beyond the social sciences and to invite people from other disciplines as well to continue this exercise of academic sharing and networking. And I'm really glad that it is a very unique kind of exercise. All these endeavors are perhaps very unique kind of endeavors which are supported by a state level regional public university. I'm proud to be part of this exercise. So in that sense also, I'm really grateful to Professor Karmalkar, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, for supporting all our small initiatives. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Professor O'Hanlon, for agreeing to be part of this ongoing exercise. I will now hand it over to Professor Kumbhojkar again.
May I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor to say a few words and share his insights with this very heterogeneous, very interdisciplinary class. Professor Karmalkar.
Thank you, Dr. Shraddha Kumbhojkar, Professor Rajeshwari Deshpande, for this wonderful initiative. And this is what, in fact, been spelled out vividly, even in the new education policy, that we must come together and break all silos. And then there would be a complete sort of a seamless integration among various different disciplines as well as faculties. And this is what we've been striving hard to do for the last 4.5 years, much prior to even the new education policy that came into existence in recent times. That was in 2020, but prior to that only, 2017 onwards, in fact, we started slowly working on these various different issues. To an extent, we were forced to do so. There are a number of reasons. First of all, there is a paucity of faculty as there is no recruitment happening. And then with whatever limited human resource that we have, there should be a horizontal mobility of both the faculty as well as the student. That was perhaps the main reason. But beside that, in fact, we must understand a bit about the other disciplines, about the other subjects. That is what also was the main objective. And keeping that thing in mind, courses like liberal education, we introduced, perhaps this is the first public state university where we are running a BA liberal art course, wherein there is science, there is history, there is science, there is social science, there are other disciplines, and so on and so forth. So student get an opportunity to get a bit of everything, and then it is left to his choice that whatever he intends to specialize, that he can choose perhaps in the second or third year. So with that intention, in fact, we've been working not necessarily only in social sciences, in other faculties also, and perhaps keeping that thing in mind, we have moved from a department system to school system. So under schools, in fact, a student would get better options, better choices, and then they can, in fact, move from one place to the other. Physically, because of the COVID thing, physically it is not happening. But yes, due to the online teaching, in fact, it has become more, I think, suitable kind of a situation wherein when I was listening to the initial introductory part, students all across the world, in fact, has joined for this particular course. And this is a wonderful thing to listen to. And I must congratulate every one of you, in fact. First of all, the speaker, who is an expert, but again, an alumni of the University of Pune, I must say, and admit it candidly, and has moved to one of the very interesting and very old university like Oxford, something age-wise not really comparable with SPPU, but SPPU, in fact, actually has the motives and objectives similar to that of Oxford, and somewhere, in fact, people say Pune as the city of, basically, it is the Oxford of the East. It is not because of the university, because of basically the long educational tradition this city enjoys. And obviously, during this entire course, the speaker has shed light on the work of Mahatma Phule and the Satyashodak Samaj. In fact, Pune been blessed with such wonderful leaders, legendaries, who in fact actually set the right tone for education, not necessarily only in the city of Pune, but for the entire state of Maharashtra and across the state also. In fact, they have followers, whether it is Lokmanya Tilak, whether it is Mahatma Phule, uh, his better half, and Kranti Jyoti Savitribai Phule. In fact, recent times you all know that our naming, in fact, has been done after her. The university presently gets known as Savitribai Phule Pune University. And in recent time, in fact, we unveiled the statue of such a great personality. And in fact, whether it is a student from deprived section or student from higher section, higher in the sense from higher social backgrounds kind of thing, for every one of them, no one got neglected during this particular period. And some person or the other actually stood like a rock and has seen to it that everyone gets into the education system, and education, there would be no barrier. It should be spread over all across the various different sections of the society. So including even those days, in fact, the girls during, because you are speaking about the colonial and post-colonial period, and wherein probably there was a plenty of dominance of the male community everywhere. And during that particular time, the social reformer like Mahatma Phule or Savitribai Phule took the initiative of teaching the girls or girl child or girls. Even some of the widows to a great extent got educated because of the work that has been done again by another legendary Karve, Dhundo Karve and Karve Shikshan Sanstha, through which, in fact, those kind of elements of the society also were actually brought into the mainstream. And this is what is the beauty of this particular city, whether it is Tilak, whether it is Kishodondo Karve, whether it is Dondo Kisho Karve, whether it is Mahatma Phule, whether it is Savitribai Phule, whether it is Agarkar, whether it is Vittal Ramji Shinde. Every one of them, in fact, considered that education is perhaps is the only instrument through which the society can be uplifted. And this is what, in fact, we've been following. Being a public state university, we all know that we, in fact, get students from economically weaker section, and to give them basically the quality sort of education, which is otherwise is generally been available only in private institution as such. And that is what we are striving hard to give them, the quality education through proper expert people. And that is what the GYAN program was all about. In fact, giving an international exposure to the student also. And there used to be physical mobility. In fact, despite the fact it is public state university, we perhaps conducted the largest GYAN program on the campus. If I am correct, and the figure is correct, it is 34 such programs all across the disciplines were conducted. And it was a real feast for the student of the Savitribai Phule University to actually interact with the international community, with the international expert. Because of the COVID, in fact, this got disengaged, this particular program. But I'm happy making use of this online platform. The IDS, Interdisciplinary School of Social Sciences, has taken this particular initiative. In last 7 days, Hanlin basically has been talking to you all every day for an hour, and then after that, perhaps discussion and deliberation on various different aspects of the topic that has been chosen, the language as well as the literature, perhaps, and the history. And history is something basically from where we need to understand, we need to basically get inspiration from that, we generally have a peculiar mentality to get stuck into the history. History basically is the glorious past. We must understand, and from that we should get inspiration and then move ahead, rather than start getting lingering into the history part as such. And that is what actually has been the problem with basically our society, whether when it comes to basically any individual leader as such, we always have put them into certain kind of frames, and then accordingly the whole society works. That should not be the case. History is something like we must get inspiration from, we must read, we must understand basically, and then move ahead with that particular inspiration also. So certain lessons normally been taught by history, and those lessons needs to be understood, and then accordingly we should move ahead. Especially in India, obviously, we generally speak about the history, generally very ancient part of it is not been taught. Our history begins some 1100 before time, and then we hardly speak about the contemporary part of it. We are always into the Mughals and the Shivaji, and there are many other basically, whether it is Cholas, whether it is Rashtrakud, whether it is basically Periyars, whether it is the northeastern part. So we must understand basically the work that has been done even by the smallest sort of a region with the tallest leaders they had, and we must know the contribution they have made. And that is what, in fact, it has to be all inclusive rather than just region specific as such. It should not be, and that is what basically has been even emphasized in the new education policy. It should be a blend of the ancient and recent. So contemporary kind of thing needs to be, in fact, taught more specifically to the students. And with that intention, in fact, I am pretty happy the kind of topic that has been chosen, especially the contribution of Mahatma Phule and the Satya Shodhak sort of a society he established, and through which, in fact, the kind of reforms he could bring in the society and could provide knowledge to the most unprivileged section of the society, and could able to bring them into the mainstream. And on that, such a wonderful sort of a series that has been organized, and we have one expert basically coming from all the way from Oxford, from the Oriental School, and speaking about it. And that's quite basically interesting, because someone like her also gets inspired by and by the work that has been done by such a social reformer as such. So once again, I congratulate first of all both the professors, Kumbhojkar as well as Rajeshwari Deshpande, and Hanalin basically for accepting our invitation and sparing your valuable time, because many times when you have to speak from, especially on in online mode, the timings also many times it becomes very bit difficult. I had the recent experience. I in fact got superannuated in the last month. I'm continuing as a vice chancellor, but as a professor I got superannuated. And one of my professor from Australia wanted to actually join my program, but because of the time problem, he could not. So despite all these problems, he could spare such a time basically, and could engage with the student for last 7 days. I'm thankful to you and hope that soon, if not soon, but sometime soon, we'll be able to meet physically and have a physical interaction. Thank you so very much.
थँक यू सो मच सर. यानंतर मी आमचे सहकारी प्राध्यापक बाबासाहेब दुधभाते कार्यक्रमामध्ये सहभागी होत आहेत. तत्पूर्वी प्राध्यापक रोझलिंड ओहॅनलन यांना विनंती की त्यांनी आपलं मनोगत व्यक्त करावं.
Thank you, Professor Kumbhojkar. Respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Karmalkar, I must thank you very warmly for sparing your time to join us this morning, and also must thank the Savitribai Phule Pune University for making available the time, the resources, and the space in the timetable for making these classes possible. The thanks is all on my side, and I cannot sufficiently convey to you how happy I am to be back amongst colleagues at the University of Pune, a place I joined first as a raw research student in 1979 with my then advisor, Professor A.R. Kulkarni, in the history department. Over the years, many colleagues in the history department and in the Department of Politics have assisted me in my work, have offered me their friendship, their support, all of the things that make research in another country possible. And in more recent times, I've been very happy to be welcomed into the Department of Politics and the Department of History to give in-person lectures, and I'm hoping very much to return in person soon. You describe the efforts that you have been making in the university in the past 5 and more years. And I must tell you that from the very high quality of the students and the discussion that we've had in the past days, your efforts have been amply rewarded. I have been saying to colleagues here what a tremendous experience it is to have conversations with students who are so well informed, students who are intellectually curious, students who are seeking to explore the boundaries between history, literature, politics, sociology. There is a real buzz of intellectual excitement that I get, that I'm getting from our participants, which of course are from across the world, but many also from Maharashtra here and from Pune itself. And I have been catching myself wishing that my students in Oxford sometimes would convey some of this high intellectual quality. So your efforts, you're pushing the interdisciplinary boundaries, encouraging these conversations are already bearing a very rich fruit. And I do congratulate you very warmly on heading in exactly, I think, the right direction, although the times, of course, are very difficult in so many ways. Professor Karmalkar, I also feel that you are exactly on the right lines in emphasizing the rich educational ecology, if I can put it like that, of the city of Pune. Of course, figures like Mahatma Phule and others of the Bahujan intellectuals are important, but they operated within, just as we do, within networks. And those it's really understanding those networks which span the whole social range that we can really begin to appreciate how it was that Pune in the later 19th and early 20th century was such a vibrant intellectual center. And for my own interests, you mentioned that we should transcend the region, and I wholly share that view. In more recent years, I have been investigating the intellectual families, the Pandit families, who left Maharashtra and served throughout India as leading intellectuals, shastris of all political persuasions, some of them very conservative, some close to the Bhakti movement, who really helped, I think, to usher in the era of modernity throughout India and not just in Maharashtra. So, although my heart lies very much in Maharashtra from my very long association with the region, I'm also very aware of the leading role, the leading intellectual role that the state, that the language region has played in much earlier eras of India's history. And really, when I think of that, somehow that chance moment back in about 1976, when I decided that I would work on the history of Maharashtra, I consider myself 3 times blessed. I went, if I can tell a very small personal anecdote, I was a master's student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and I was looking around for a research topic. I went to my guide and I said, I've been reading about this chap, Phule, never heard of him, and I believe there must be a misprint in the textbook, because it says that this man, Phule, and his wife started a school for girls and a school for untouchables in the late 1840s. Now, surely that is a misprint. No, said my guide, that is absolutely correct. Ah, I said, I've found my research topic. So many people ask me, how did you come to this? And that is how I came. And as I look round now, and I look back over the long years in which I have had engagement with the society, the language, the culture, I bless that choice that I made in the later 1970s. And I look forward very much to my first visit in person to Maharashtra, which I hope will be early next year. And so may I conclude by thanking you, Professor Karmalkar, very warmly for all that you've done to make this occasion possible. And may I also thank my colleagues, Professors Deshpande and Kumbojkar, and the others in the Department of Politics, the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, the Department of History, that have made this occasion possible, which has been an immense source of enrichment, inspiration, and enjoyment for me. So thank you very much, all of you, and long may our interactions and our networking continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rohan. Conversations has been a theme that has been running through the past 3-4 lectures, and you've taken it beautifully. We all have, I hope, contributed to this conversation. May I now request my colleague, Professor Babasaheb Dudbate, to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Madam. सावित्रीबाई फुले पुणे विद्यापीठ आणि सावित्रीबाई फुले पुणे विद्यापीठ इतिहास विभाग यांच्या वतीने आपण आयोजित केलेल्या या अप्रोचेस टू हिस्ट्री अँड लिटरेचर या 5 दिवसीय व्याख्यानमालेत आज पुणे विद्यापीठाचे कुलगुरू या समारोप प्रसंगी उपस्थित आहेत. आदरणीय करमरकर सरांनी या सर्व कार्यक्रमांना मान्यता दिली. त्यामुळे हा संबंध कार्यक्रम देशभर आणि देशाच्या बाहेरही ऐकण्याची संधी खूप मिळाली. आणि ऑक्सफर्ड विद्यापीठातील प्राध्यापकांचा हा पुणे विद्यापीठाशी असणारा हा संवाद खूप फ्रुटफुली आणि खूप अकॅडमिक लेवलला खूप चांगल्या पद्धतीने पार पडलेला आहे. आणि म्हणून मी आदरणीय सरांचे, व्हाईस चान्सलर सरांची मी मनपूर्वक इतिहास विभाग आणि IDSच्या वतीने मी आभार व्यक्त करतो. आणि ऑक्सफर्ड युनिव्हर्सिटी आणि आपला ऑक्सफर्ड ऑफ ईस्ट यांचा हा डायलॉग पुढे भविष्यातही सर अशा माध्यमातून आम्ही चालू ठेवण्याचा प्रयत्न करू. या व्याख्यानमालेच्या मुख्य व्याख्याता प्रोफेसर रोझलिन मॅडम यांनी वेळ दिला आणि 5 दिवस ही व्याख्यानमाला त्यांनी दिली. त्याबद्दल सावित्रीबाई फुले पुणे विद्यापीठाच्या वतीनं मी प्राध्यापिका रोझलिना मॅडमचं आभार व्यक्त करतो. त्यानंतर IDS आणि CSSच्या संचालिका प्राध्यापक डॉक्टर राजेश्वरी देशपांडे मॅडमनी हा कोर्स घेण्यासाठी सपोर्ट केला आणि IDSच्या माध्यमातून निधी उपलब्ध करून दिला. त्यामुळे मी इतिहास विभागाच्या वतीने मॅडमचे आभार व्यक्त करतो. त्यानंतर खूप जे पार्टिसिपंट आहेत, सर्व सहभागी, पुणे विद्यापीठ, महाराष्ट्राच्या बाहेर आणि काही इतर देशातून सहभागी आहेत, त्यांचे मी इतिहास विभाग पुणे विद्यापीठ यांच्या वतीने आभार मानतो. इतिहास विभागातील सहकारी माझे सहकारी प्राध्यापक मगर सर आणि अहिरे सर यांचे मी आभार मानतो. आम्हाला सहयोग करणारे इतिहास विभागातील संशोधक विद्यार्थी तुकाराम, सागर, बापू आणि इतिहास विभागाचा स्टाफ आणि राज्यशास्त्र विभागाचा स्टाफ आणि तेथील सहकारी या सगळ्यांचे मी आभार व्यक्त करतो आणि हा समारोपाचा कार्यक्रम इथे संपला असे जाहीर. थँक्यू ऑल ऑफ.
मनापासून धन्यवाद सगळ्यांना. Right. So maybe now begin with the lecture, or Professor
Yes.
O'Hanlon, you want to catch your breath for a couple of
No,
minutes?
that is fine. Let us move seamlessly forward after that very pleasant and kindly welcome from your respected Vice Chancellor.
Just like a teacher.
I will now share my screen, a minute. Sorry. I have. Sorry, I'm. Pardon me. Share, hopefully. Okay, and slideshow. Right. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Working well.
Well, welcome all of you to this fourth day of our lecture series, and thank you for bearing with us during those very pleasant remarks from our hosts. So today our gaze goes back a little bit in time and then forward again. And I want today to bring us back to that really very difficult question about the relationship between History 1 and History 2. I'm here offering you, because I think it's helpful, a very brief summary of what we have discussed so far. Firstly, of course, the postcolonial approaches challenge older constructions of tradition and modernity by focusing on the idea of the early modern and the notion that modernity, that's to say globalization, had its points of origin in many across the world, and that in that era, India, the Indian subcontinent, was a leading player. We've also discussed the way in which postcolonial perspectives ask us to decenter Europe, to look at some of the concepts, the categories that we've inherited from that period, but really to look at them in the context of their own local settings. What do terms like citizenship mean in the Indian setting, for example? It means looking at their contested histories, finding new meanings for them in ways that we can broaden the conversation to bring in the multitude of experiences and voices in India's modern democratic order. We've also looked at, been thinking about the ways in which postcolonial approaches allow us to think about the kinds of history that were written in India's pre-colonial era. And we've also, of course, raised this question about the relationship between History 1 and History 2. How can we manage that relationship whilst maintaining some kind of authority for History 1, but in ways which promote an interaction, a real dialogue between both kinds of history. and here I've tried to carry forward 4 proposals that I outlined in the first lecture, which I think are helpful pointers to some of the ways in which we can do that. So here is a question for us. Is history 1 what we might call a derivative practice in India? As we know, the old Orientalist scholars like James Mill said there's no real history writing in India because there's no kind of sense of history, and because there was no real social or political change, there was just tradition. So how could people write history in a society which was frozen in time? Now, of course, you know, that was a long time ago that was said, but there is a serious point here. And if I can put it, Dipesh Chakrabarti, as usual, puts this better than anybody else. And when he says that modern history writing, that's to say history 1, came to India only with the coming of colonialism. And it's at that point that colonialism taught Indians to think of their own identity as citizens in terms of the nation state. And of course, history writing in Europe first emerged as the servant of the new nation states. So is it really the case that history 1, as it exists in India now, is just a hangover from colonial times, a derivative discourse? Now, if we say that, there is an irony in that it seems to put Dipesh Chakrabarti and others rather uncomfortably close to the old Orientalist camp, who also said that India has no tradition of any kind of empirical, fact-based, evidence-based history writing. So let's look at some of the ways in which we might move forward. Well, some of the ways that we need to move forward, as I've suggested, and this is one thing I want to do today, is to get a much better understanding of how history was written in pre-colonial times. We also need to get away from the idea that there's only one way of doing history 1. And we need to appreciate, as I've said, that there are a lot of similarities between history 1, between history writing across the board and, in fact, literature. On the other hand, I've tried to hold on to the idea that history 1 is a distinctive type of activity, which doesn't just make truth claims, but employs techniques of verification. Literature makes truth claims, but those are emotional truths and not usually linked to specific events, or at least we don't judge literature by its absolute degree of factual accuracy, specific factual accuracy in the past. We appreciate that writers of novels have some latitude when they go about their business. So let's return to this question and first of all ask, is history 1 essentially an import from Europe in the Indian setting? So looking first at the pre-colonial era, I'd like to draw your attention to something which is dealt with in some of the readings that you've looked at for today, Rama Mantena's article, reviewing this book, Textures of Time. Now, this is a book that many of you may already be familiar with, those of you who have looked at pre-colonial cultures in India. And textures, what this book, which is written by our old friend Sanjay Subramaniam, as well as Narayana Rao and others. These authors focus on a very distinctive community of scribal people, people whose job it was to be able to write, to keep accounts, to follow histories, classes of clerks. In South India, they're called Karanam, We also know them by other terms, Munshi, Kayastha, Vakil, Chitnis, and other terms in other parts of India. Now, these were the people, Karanims were the servants of the early modern states that I've described, states that were using the techniques of the bureaucrat to collect revenues, to track property rights, and really to make early modern states, those states under the Mughal imperial umbrella, to make them into much more effective military powers, cash-based trading societies, and so on. So how do these clerkly classes actually write history? Why did they write history? Well, when we look at the kinds of histories that they write, they include the many different genres in which history in those days was written, as I've indicated earlier this week. They incorporate Puranic passages, they incorporate kinds of Rajaniti, didactic literature telling princes how to rule. They use gazetteer-like lists of the resources of states. They draw on Persian chronicles. So they have these very factual bases for their work, but they also, we also have in their works the actions of the gods. So, you know, after a battle, suddenly a god will appear and say this, I have gifted this battle to the victors. So miracles and gods appear alongside factual accounts. These Karanims, Munshis, Chitnesses, Kayasthas, whatever you like to call them, also treated time differently. On the one hand, they had a strong sense of chronological time, but they also wrote about time as if it was something cyclical. Time could also be circular. They also wrote, they also used interesting devices, a device called Kalanyan, the understanding of time, in which in a history, somebody pops up and makes a prophecy that I prophesy that in the future this will happen. And you, the reader, knows that it's going to happen because you know the later history. So there are all sorts of ways in which these Karanims play with time. In what ways then can we think of these as writing a kind of history one in between these other passages in their texts, which look like forms of history too? Well, something that's very important to Karanim writers is that they assert the reliability of their narratives. Sometimes they do it sort of right at the end, rather than as part of the account, but verification is very important to them. The authors of the book Textures of Time say, who want to claim this empirical evidence-based character for these Karanim writers, the authors of the book, they say, well, native readers, they say local readers, native readers would have understood the shifts of register, that if you were a reader in Tamil country or Maharashtra, you would have understood perfectly well that the sequence about the battle was something that was a factual history. But on the other hand, when the god turns up, you understood that it was something else. And Rama Mantena, of course, whose work I hope you've read, takes up this and really pushes, is this really a tenable position? So let's look at an example of one of these types of account, one of these Karanim productions. It is in the Marathi genre of the Bhakar. The term Bhakar comes from the Perso-Arabic word Akbar, and that means news. It refers to the daily newsletters, factual newsletters that Indian courts provided in the pre-colonial era. And so this is a kind of Marathi version of this Perso-Arabic term, and it comes to refer to these early, very factual histories that proliferate in Maharashtra in the early modern period, and we can trace their rise to the expansion of Maratha power in the 17th century. And of course, the person who has written most effectively about these is the great historian of Maharashtra, Prachi Deshpande, whose work many of you will know. So, like Textures of Time, as the authors suggested, this Bakar, this Subhasa Bakar, contains both types of writing, both factual, long factual passages, and then suddenly up will pop the goddess. So let's look a little bit in more detail at this text. It was written by Krishnaji Anant Subhasad, who was a servant of the Maratha court of Rajaram, the second son of Shivaji Maharaj in the 1690s. And Subhasad had himself been alive at the time of Shivaji. And so you can see why they might have asked this very distinguished old state servant to write this history. The history, as we'll see in a moment, has very long and detailed narrative about Shivaji's life, his exploits, his administrative innovations, the types of forts that he kept, how he looked after state resources. But there are also other passages. The goddess Bhavani appears to him at moments of crisis. And he himself predicts things that we know, in fact, will happen after his death. So Subhasad uses this device of the Kalanyan, the prophecy written that the reader knows in advance will actually happen. Just to give you a flavor of the factual basis of this text. The text, and here on your right, you will see a Modi manuscript form of the Bakar, and it opens, this is Subhasad himself, the old Maratha court servant, talking in his writing. He says, for the attention of Srimant Maharaj Rajashri Rajaram Sahib Chhatrapati, that's to say Rajaram, this servant, Krishnaji Anant Subhasad of the Royal Council, respectfully submits as follows. Your Majesty asked, our father, the elder king, that's to say Shivaji Maharaj, the elder king performed many acts of bravery and defeated 4 different empires. That being so, nonetheless, he's saying, Aurangzeb came and captured many of our forts. What was the cause of this? How did this happen, he's saying, in our kingdom? How did that weakness come about? So Subhasad continues, these are my orders, he's saying. Rajaram said to me, you are a man knowledgeable about the affairs of the old kingdom. So write and give us the history of his life, of Shivaji's life, from the beginning. This was your order. Accordingly, this is what happened. So you can see that this is very much an emphasis on factual reconstruction by an experienced servant of Shivaji Maharaj's court, whose account therefore would be reliable. So that this is, we have here the stage set for something very like elements of History 1. A strong consciousness that if you want to know what happened, you ask someone who was there at the time, and that they understand their job to tell you really what happened in those days. That's one, I think, piece of evidence that History 1 was not a completely alien form of intellectual activity in pre-colonial India. But let's ask about popular practices outside the world of scribes. After all, we're concerned with popular practices. As I've indicated, in this early modern era, rites of many kinds came to be recorded on paper and stored as part of the records of local states. Why? because local states wanted to raise revenue, and how much better a way to raise revenue than record who owns what, and therefore who owes what in taxes, in land revenues. So contemporaries from the top to the bottom of society across India at this time were acutely aware of the importance of historical narratives when it came to legitimizing their rights, to defending their rights, both against the state, who might say, who might misconstrue what they owed, and defending their rights against local rivals, who might be off to the local state, the offices of state officials, to try and register the land in their own names. And of course, this is a familiar practice. Rights could be of many kinds: rights to land, rights to revenues in cash and kind, rights to offices and the rewards they carried, rights to privileged forms of landholding, for example, tax-free land holdings. So if you had any of those rights, and people from top to bottom possessed those rights, possessed rights of some kind, even if it were the rights of Mahars or the rights of Chamars, holding rights was spread throughout society. So if you were a holder of rights, you were very sharply aware of the need to know how those rights came into being, so that you could defend them if challenged, and know how you should go about defending them when it came to paper records. So just a little bit of local history. In the 17th, 16th to 18th centuries, whenever local rights in Maharashtra were challenged, whenever there was an issue, there would be a local judicial assembly convened of state officials, prominent local men, and very often the village balutadars, that those who occupied important village offices. And these assemblies were called majlis, so that's just a Persian word for an assembly. But the documents that they produced, and here you have an image of, not a very good image, I'm afraid, of one on the screen, called, the documents they were produced were called mazar. And a mazar typically would be written down, taken down by scribes at the end of one of these meetings. And what the scribe would do he would write, okay, here is the history of the rights in question. Here is the decision that this assembly came to about whose rights these properly are. And then that paper document would be stamped with seals, and you can see all the seals on this document. And they would also be signed, and you can see here the Modi signatures, as well as some signatures in Persian. So here again is a very good evidence, I think, that pre-colonial India was very familiar, not just with empirical forms of history writing, but with procedures of verification, because this is exactly what this is. These are procedures for confirming the authenticity of a narrative account. And had many of you been living in the times of your great-great-great-grandfathers, it's very likely that part of your family records may have contained exactly documents of this kind. You may not see them very often now, because of course records now are held in digital form, but this was the bread and butter of conversations about history, about authenticity, about rights in the early modern era. So those are some of the ways in which really fact-based, empirical, evidence-based histories were written in the early modern period. This, I think, is evidence that History 1 was not wholly an alien import into India. That said, we also need to be aware that history, forms of history, which may have contained elements of history 1, also of history 2, that these were written in many genres. And we've mentioned this here. We have some of the genres: hagiography, for example, extolling the powers of saints, such as stories about the poet Tulsidas's meeting with Mughal princes that you can see in this illustration here. Here you have a Mughal prince there in his boat going to meet the poet Tulsidas. And we don't know that that actually happened, but those who retailed this tradition told stories of that kind. Then we have genealogies of elite families, accounts of bards, such as the Rajput traditions, which helped inform the work of the colonial historian James Todd, who worked, of course, on Rajasthan. Then we have courtly histories celebrating the deeds of great warriors, like the Rajbhasha histories of Keshav Das of the Rajput kingdom of Orcha, celebrating the valor of the region's Bundela warriors. And we have autobiographies like this one, extraordinary autobiography written in 1641 by a Jain merchant, Banarsi Das. His book, now very famous and well circulated, now published many times, Arda Katana, Half a Story, is literally a history of his life. Then, of course, we have the form of the prashasti, the praise of the patron, usually written in Sanskrit at the start, perhaps, of a work of Dharma Shastra. I start this work with praise of the patron who has given me the support that I needed to write it. So none of these genres would have worked had there not been some factual basis for their writing. But of course, these forms of narratives also contained elements of history too, elements of literature, which expressed truths, if you like, of belief and emotion. And our Textures of Time authors would argue that local readers would have understood those differences. They weren't just kind of muddled, couldn't tell the difference between fact and myth. So let's move now forward to early history writing under the East India Company. Here we have a very prominent Orientalist early historian and scholar, Colonel Colin Mckenzie. He was an army officer, he was a collector of old archives, and he collected many manuscripts in South India from what he called native informants. And for this, you should see the work of the American historian Nicholas Dirks, who's written a book about Mckenzie and his collection. Many of those manuscripts are now in the British Library, and I'll come back to that. Now, in his treatment of these manuscripts, Mckenzie follows really a very crude set of intellectual procedures. As far as Mckenzie is concerned, he looks at a manuscript and says, okay, where are the facts? Where are the facts in here? The rest of it is unimportant. So he was not interested in facts in context, in how a fact is created, who says what is a fact. He was simply interested in reliable facts, as he called it, and discarded everything else. So that gives you some sense of the way in which these very two-dimensional, prejudicially empirical colonial histories came into being. Now, we now understand the limitations of those kinds of colonial knowledge, but we now understand something else. And I think now of the participant who said rather regretfully a couple of days ago, of course, so many of our archives are now no longer accessible to us because they are in museums and archives abroad. But those who have studied the Mckenzie archive now know that, in fact, Mckenzie himself was very often duped. He went around with teams of local assistants, and they would put out the word, we're collecting information about who owns the land in these parts. We're collecting information about who, what the history of the local communities are. And of course, word went out. So every landowner who had their eye on the next door piece of land naturally got in their assistant and quick wrote a piece of history with their own agenda, and duly presented it very gravely to Mckenzie's assistant. Here is a reliable local account of the land owning in my region. So of course, what Mckenzie took home with him in quite large part was a load of fabrications. And so when we come to think about this construct that we call colonial knowledge, we increasingly appreciate that colonial knowledge actually contained many local voices. We need to see it as something more, a form of dialogue, a dialogue which very often the colonial officials didn't see. But these were certainly an occasion when many local people, particularly local people who were in good positions, could get in their own narratives, their own accounts. So if you wanted to understand the order of landowning in South India of Mackenzie's time, you would not actually primarily go to the documents he collected. If you wanted to know about people's ambitions, you might go there, but they're not a reliable account for reasons that I've explained. So even in colonial knowledge, we understand that colonial subjects were able to exercise some forms of agency. So let's turn now, moving forward, to look at the history of history in the later colonial period. Much of this now you will be familiar with, the arguments here. The later colonial period, of course, saw the rise of huge popular energies in castes, sects, religious communities, different regions, those who identified themselves as Aryans or Dravidians, all came up in this great wave of popular history writing. And partly that's, I think, a consequence of the new prominence of the universities in the late colonial period and the new reputation that History 1, history the discipline, was acquiring in that period. Everybody's beginning to think we need some of that to defend our identity, our rights, to better know who we are. It's a very interesting fact that historians of the time, and here again, we look at Dipesh Chakrabarty's work, his work on the great historian Jaidinath Sarkar. Now, for Jaidinath Sarkar, he was the kind of person who would have gone to would have looked at a document and said, I'm only interested in the facts. Tell me the facts, the rest of it is irrelevant. So in fact, he was very grieved, very sad to see this great wave of popular history writing, because he thought, well, these are not people who have done it properly, the way that, facts and facts alone. And so as he saw it at the end of his life, the whole historical profession was collapsing because there were all these interlopers who were saying we're writing history too, and didn't know how to do it properly. And I've suggested that we need to move beyond that kind of dichotomy. We continue here with this question, the relationship between History 1 and History 2. I don't need now to remind you what those two things are. So we'll move forward at a good pace. Here we have Chakrabarty's great question, how to think about the relationship between them. And as far as Chakrabarty is concerned, I think, really, the fact of the challenge from popular histories means that History 1 is almost unviable. He says, the casualty of this history war has been the historical method itself. And I think that's too pessimistic a judgment, and we'll circle back to that as we go on. I want to come now to one of the articles that I suggested you read, and this is the article by Mira Ashar, and her argument, and here we come again to the relations between history and literature. What she sees in the work that she's analysing, Karan Ghelo, 1866, she wants to make the case that this extraordinary first historical novel written in Gujarati needs to be understood as a kind of, as a work of history, also as a work of literature, but also primarily as something that is offering an ethical space for reflection. I won't go in details here about the story. It's the story, of course, of the last Rajput king of Gujarat and how he came to fall. The story is familiar to us from other narratives, Meru Tungas Vichar Shreni, Padmanabha's Kanhadari Prabandha. But unlike those renderings of this story, Mehta, who was not just a social reformer, but a very deep scholar of Gujarat's history and literary traditions, he draws on a whole range of sources to write his history: oral histories, Rajput genealogies, Persian histories, Jain accounts, and so on. As Mehta, as Ashar points out, Mehta's work shows an astonishing familiarity with these sources. But what he's actually trying to do is draw his readers into reflecting about the deep issues and challenges of their own colonial times. Issues like the troubled relations between rulers and their Brahmin ministers, caste hierarchies, the history of Hinduism and Islam, the existence of God, the role of religious asceticism, the question of karma and fate, the place of women in society. I'll just move to the next slide because I see that I've repeated some material here. So Mehta offers this work of historical fiction as really an ethical space. He's set up a clear historical framework because he knows that this is what will draw his readers in to engage with it, much more than if he had just made a load of things up. But the questions he has are modern and colonial in nature. He's not offering any easy answers. There are no obvious villains, not the invading Muslims, not the villainous Brahmin minister, not the reckless Rajput king. Rather, Mehta is saying to his readers, his Gujarati readers of the 1860s, what should we be doing at this time in this crisis in our history and culture? How should we think about the past, the present, and the future? And the way that the novel finishes, I think, is a beautiful illustration of the way that Mehta is drawing history and literature together to create this extraordinary space in which people can think, can reflect. He says, since Karan Ghela's death, 550 years have elapsed since then. Those Rajputs, those Muslims, those Marathas, where are they now? What has become of them? Who would believe that indolent, weak, and decadent Rajputs of today are descended from the valiant race that once ruled the land? Who would believe that the weak, starving, illiterate Muslims of today have descended from the Muslims of yore? And for the Marathas, no trace of their former glory survives. All have been subjugated by the white man. The Bhatts and Charans, who once graced the courts of kings, the singers of bards, now wander the hills and jungles. The whole of Gujarat is under British control. But by God's grace, this province will once again flourish and achieve greatness in a different way, and knowledge, art, and social reform will spread over this beautiful land. May it once again become a garden of paradise, the abode of Lakshmi, the storehouse of all virtue. Astu, astu, so be it. So you can see there a really beautiful challenge between a really beautiful challenge that Mehta makes to his readers. And it is really by drawing elements of History 1. You couldn't write that novel without very deep historical learning, by bringing elements of History 1 and elements of History 2 and a wonderful literary style into the same work. So we see this as History 2. It does incorporate many elements of History 1, and it weaves them into something new altogether, something with a very clearly contemporary purpose. Let's move now to Foulé's slavery. Now, we sort of covered quite a lot of this in an earlier class, and so I won't spend very much time over this slide. We can come back to it. But the point really that I'm trying to make here is that we shouldn't see the way that Foulé uses the Dashavatar, the 10 incarnations of Vishnu, the theme of the Aryan invasions. We shouldn't see those things as undermining or detracting from the densely accurate sociology with which Foulé fills his accounts. As I would like to classify this account as a work of historical sociology, as well as a work of kind of imagined history using the materials that Foulé had to hand. So I won't, as we've talked about this quite a lot, I won't linger on that. We can certainly come back to it in the discussion. And here I continue with some of the same points. So again, this is a work of History 2, certainly not a novel. It's a political call to arms, but it does incorporate a very substantial range of historical and sociological materials. Two works of History 2, which incorporate elements of History 1, of Sociology 1, if you like, without which they wouldn't have been compelling or indeed comprehensible to readers. So let's go back to this question: what should be the relationship between the two kinds of history, the second of which can be written in many genres, including literary genres? I think we have to see this relationship as more complex. I've spoken and we've discussed earlier in the week about how the hope is that both sides, if they're willing to have a conversation, should endeavor to learn from each other. For History 1, the fact of History 2 texts having been written is enormously important, an enormously important pointer to contemporary social currents. For example, Mehta's work draws us in to explore the potential of vernacular fiction to prompt new ways of thinking about India's colonial past. And Foulé's text, of course, alerts us to the wide range of anger amongst marginalized and Dalit communities, appreciation in the colonial era, and indeed to Bahujan leaders' appreciation of global historical trends at this period. And both of these texts, which are primarily texts of History 2, compel our admiration for the dense world that their authors have been able to create. They've taken popular renderings of older histories, bardic histories, oral traditions, familiar religious texts, everyday ritual practices, and drawn these together to create new worlds in which their audiences find new identities in the present. So History 1 has to be respectful in appreciating the complexity of these things and the groundedness of many of what we're looking at, in forms of historical or sociological reality. And as History 1 looks at the kind of dialogue that we might have, we also need to remember that, as Hayden White reminds us, that History 1 also uses the techniques of literature. You know, we don't anymore think about either Colonel Colin Mckenzie, bring me the facts, nothing else is important, or indeed like Jadinath Sarkar for all his great achievements. For him also, a fact was a fact and nothing else really mattered. Our approach now is very much more nuanced, an approach in which, through conversation, both kinds of history can learn from each other. Of course, these questions also, these two authors also help us understand much more about what colonial knowledge actually was. Neither of these are simply passively, neither Foulé nor Mehta are passively absorbing what the colonial state tells them. Rather, they have a deep appreciation of their own histories and bring that appreciation to their narratives and their challenges to their contemporaries in the present day. There are other things that History 1, other questions that History 1 asks of History 2, which perhaps History 2 doesn't necessarily do, although it may. One of these questions has to do with audiences. It's one of the most difficult problems that we face as any kind of historian is audiences. Who read these things? Who heard them? How were, in what setting were they circulated, read, debated, discussed? Were they read as an act of private reading? We talked about this yesterday. Were they read aloud to those with fewer literate skills? How were such texts circulated? Who published them? Were they borrowed through vernacular libraries? How were they discussed and understood? And how did their themes percolate out into other literary texts? Now, of course, it's not the case that History 2 doesn't care about these questions. In fact, most authors of History 2 also are interested. You know, they don't want to write works which won't have an audience or which won't be popular. So again, you have areas of shared concern. And these are also areas of concern for literature. How do literary texts circulate? Who reads them? How do they move from one genre to another? But of course, as I've said, History 1 always looks for its truth in the particular events, particular lives, eras as we understand them, institutions, and so on. Whereas writers of literature, and to some extent writers of history too, seek forms of truth in their work, but truths of human experience and emotion. Those truths may be closely connected with the particular, but that's not how we judge them. That's not how we rate them. The criterion for scholars of literature, indeed all those who enjoy literature of different kinds, is whether it opens for us emotional truths of the kind in which we can recognize ourselves, discover new things about ourselves, or find ourselves supported or challenged. And in fact, we might say that great literature is literature that is open to that kind of experience universally. So the public life then of history in the present, what I've argued is that History 1 is not an alien form of writing in the Indian context. I also want to say, for those of you who think I'm being, as it were, too accommodating to History 2, that we shouldn't romanticize it. Of course, History 2 has agendas of many different kinds. And in our discussions between History 1 and History 2, some we may want to challenge, some we may want to engage in a conversation about how we know these things, about the kinds of context that History 2 is writing about. And in case you think this is all very difficult, let me just remind you, and I don't think this is overstating it, the fact of the matter is that History 1, professional history, has always existed in contentious dialogue with amateur, popular citizens' history, working class history, gender history, Black history. You look back into the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, there has always been this dialogue. And in fact, for any good professional historian will always tell you popular history, the histories that these insurgent, insistent popular histories, that read those, because there you will find new sources of fertilization for the subject. These are not people simply to say you've got the facts wrong. You know, I don't want to know. Without this engagement with these contemporary questions from our own time, our history, as professional history, History 1, will stagnate and die. So does that mean that we're at the constant risk of professional history becoming just another kind of History 2, that it's becoming the servant of the political concerns of our day? Well, I don't think so. And this takes me back to our 4 proposals. I've argued the way in which History 1 continues to be a viable form of intellectual practice with its own distinctive practices of authentication, with its own distinctive notion of a community of fellow craft practitioners, and its distinctive focus on individual events. What happens then when we're confronted with agendas that are more immediately served by History 2? What do we do as practitioners of History 1? Well, we understand, all of us, that our own questions about the past come from our own time. They come from our own present day historical concern, political and cultural and so forth concerns. So, you know, how can we admit to that without saying, well, you know, we're just really a part of History 2? Well, the reason that we don't have to be embarrassed about that is very simple. And in describing this, I'm sure this will speak to the experience of many of you when you've gone off, you know, for your master's thesis or your PhD thesis. You come up with what you think is a really good research idea. Perhaps something from your own time, something that sparked an idea, and then off you go to, it may be an archive, or it may be a set of oral sources, it may be a library, and you look at what is there. And as you go on, you will, I'm sure many of you have had the experience that, well, actually, there's nothing much about my question here. But hey, there is all this other stuff. I hadn't thought of this. I can engage with this if I change my question. And then so that's how historians work. You have these questions that come to you from the present, and then you submit them to the test of how do they stand up to, how do they make sense of the material that we've inherited from the past? Do they make sense of it? If they don't make sense of it, then they're the wrong questions and we have to change our questions. So in that way, I think we can, as History 1, we can say entirely without embarrassment, yes, we do get our questions from the present. And yes, the way we do things very often changes in dialogue with History 1. We have to do things like that. In fact, that is what enriches our practice. But how do we then, what other safeguards do we have against simply becoming a branch of History 2? Well, this is another of my 4 proposals, which is the community of fellow practitioners of the craft. And history is a craft. Both History 1 and History 2 are forms of craft. And what we do is we look to our colleagues. You know, would you mind taking a look at this draft? Would you mind reading a draft of my thesis? And we rely on colleagues, junior, senior, to come back to us and say, well, this bit works fine, but I think you're really, I think you're really over reading the evidence there. I would go back and look at that again. So we rely on the fellow members of our community, communities of the sort that we are engaging in today. So this really brings me back to that 4th proposal, that history is a dialogue between the present and the past. I'm not the first to say that. Many much more distinguished people than I am have said that, but it's something that I believe profoundly to be true. True but fine, and not just fine, that's how we have to work. So I don't believe, I'm less pessimistic than Professor Chakrabarty, that the casualty of the history war has been the historical method itself. Rather, I would say that History 1 has never been a settled or stable matter. It's found itself over the last century in a process of continuous challenge and change. Voices from the margins, women's history, working class history, Black history, now histories from the post-colonial world, LGBTQ, etc. histories, all of them challenge us to rethink the way that we do things, to rethink the questions that we ask. And we've been exploring some of those, the way in which we might do that today. So tomorrow in our last class, we turn to Dalit life narratives, another field in which history and literature overlap, merge into, and yet stand apart from one another. And I look forward very much to that discussion. So forgive us and thank you very much to all of you for bearing with us in this rather long session today. And so with Professor Kumbojka's consent, may I invite your questions? I hope very much that those of you who haven't particularly wanted to join the conversation so far will want to either type in the chat box, ask your question in English or Marathi, we welcome those questions equally from our YouTube participants as from our Zoom participants.
There's a raised hand from Praveen.
Praveen, namaskar. Bola.
Ma'am, thank you for your lectures. Ma'am, in all the 4 lectures that you were teaching, there is too much emphasis on H1 and H2. But I just would like to ask you, in India, there is too much emphasis on the Cambridge School of History, or let's say the Quintessential School of Thought. So, right. Let's say students who work on ideas, or let's say students who work on history of ideas or political thought or intellectual history, sometimes I think the Cambridge School is too much burdening in writing, dealing with H2. Because yes. H2 is not just merely dependent on the context. For example, Jyotiba Phule, or let's say Kabir or Tukaram, they're not dependent on the context of anything. Because the moment Phule says Baliraja, Phule is not speaking to the 18th century Maharashtra. Phule is also connecting the 18th century Maharashtra to, and I think of the past. Yes. So what do we do with the Cambridge School per se? Because how do we navigate between H1 and H2 and the Cambridge School?
Thank you, Praveen. That's a really good question. 2 things I'd say. I believe that H1 and H2, as I have used them and used them very liberally, I don't want to give the impression that these are things in two completely separate boxes. In fact, what I've tried to do is to say in all sorts of ways they overlap. Nonetheless, it's useful for the sake of argument to keep that distinction in mind. So if I can ask all of you to, to bear in mind that it's a useful tool for discussion rather than two watertight compartments. Now, Praveen, when we talk about the Cambridge School, you're really talking about the approach, I think, that was first outlined by Quentin Skinner, which is the kind of context-based approach. Now, Quentin Skinner is, I think, one of the cleverest people in the world. I mean, so clever that I have to read what he writes 5 or 6 times to get what actually he is saying. And I'm still not sure that I've understood it very correctly. What he's basically saying in talking about context, what he's trying to say, I think, is that when we look at intellectuals, when we look at intellectual history, we should always be doing 2 things. We should, on the one hand, bear in mind that any intellectual will be conscious of the long train of previous thinkers, the long tradition to which he belongs. So his or her voice isn't just a voice disconnected from the past, but it is in conversation with past voices. At the same time, Skinner draws our attention to the fact that that voice in the present, and this is where your point comes in, that voice in the present is never simply an expression of a tradition. It is also deeply immersed in the present. What Skinner is also trying to draw our attention to is what he calls, and this is a kind of fancy term where I don't think you need a fancy term. He calls in mind, he talks about the illocutionary force of a statement. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that when you make a statement, like, for example, these Brahmins are the descendants of Aryan invaders, those are not just words, they do something in the world. They make a difference in the world. That by using this term, he's trying to draw our attention to the fact that, that words are so much more than words. Words are so much more than what's on the text. Words reverberate. Our words resonate. Our words go to places we never anticipated. They have effects. We might anticipate some that we didn't. So when I think of the Cambridge schools, that context focused approach, I think it's helpful to remember that Skinner is not just saying the past, that voices in the present, it's all down to context. And he's saying that, he's not saying that the tradition out of which the voice speaks doesn't matter, that it's only context. And what he's trying to say is, so he's trying to do both, I think, but he's also trying to say, and here I think the point that you make is a very good one. You know, if you imagine yourselves back into that era of Fule, you imagine the way that his words reverberated, that his words were not just words, his words made a difference. His words changed things, changed relationships, changed power dynamics, changed material things. So I hope, Praveen, that's at least my understanding of what Skinner is trying to do. He's trying to bridge 2 things, and he's trying to say something about the power of words. So at the same time, you know, people like Skinner, you know, I truly believe that theory, like Skinner, is only helpful to us if it helps us make sense of our material. You know, very often, you know, I read somebody's draft and it's full of fancy theory. And I kind of say to them, look, how does this help you with your material? You know, if it doesn't help you, you don't need it. So I think there's also a sense that people feel, particularly people early in their career, feel very intimidated, feel that they need this theory to establish their credentials. But I think it's absolutely the case. Theory matters only if it helps you. If it helps you, great, use it. Go to work on it, understand what it's saying. Praveen, I hope that gives you some help there, or at least partly helps answer that very good question. Now, who should we pick up now?
Nitika Sharma in
Nitika
the chat box. Yeah.
In the chat box, yes. The history of Persian ghazals. How can we study poetry as a source to study the history of the subcontinent? Well, I mean, 2 or 3 things which, as you're a specialist in this era, this will not be news to you. This is not an area that I've particularly worked on, but the history of Persian poetry. But of course, in the making of a Mughal cultured gentleman, which was a very important cultural process in that Persianate world, the ghazal mattered. You know, you were not an educated person, you were not a cultured person, unless you enjoyed Persian poetry. So one of the ways in which we can look at this poetry for evidence is of the broader culture in which it was read, spoken, enjoyed. And another way in which we can use it as evidence, if I can put it like that, is to look at its audiences. In what settings was poetry enjoyed? And here I'm thinking of those very popular evening sessions. I'm currently forgetting the Persian word for them. Those very popular evening settings in which poets would perform their ghazals, their other poetic, other genres of poetry. And people would sit together and they would enjoy, it would be a collective aesthetic experience. It was an opportunity for patrons to show off their house, their furnishings, their servants. So looking at the audiences for those things would, I think, that they're useful as evidences. A third way, and perhaps a less obvious way, is to look at their limitations. Who didn't enjoy Persian poetry? I mean, one of the things which I think the historian of Maharashtra is, and this is something that the very good historian of the Deccan Sultanate states, Roy Fischel, has written about, is, and of course, Richard Eaton's wonderful recent work on the broader Persianate world. Somehow or other, in the Marathi-speaking regions, although people used lots of Persian words, kind of technical revenue terms to do with revenue. I mean, as you'll know, there are a lot of Persian words in Marathi language. Nonetheless, outside the circles of Mughal imperial servants, Persian did not find a ready audience. It wasn't enjoyed. There was some kind of a limit to the power of Persian. And that's an interesting question, why? So I hope, Nitika, that gives you some sense. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already, but that's some of the ways in which we can use literature, draw on literature as a source for history. Okay, where shall we go next?
There's a question in the chat box itself by Nabila.
Nabila,
Yeah.
thank you. Is it possible to distinguish between autobiography and memoirs in terms of literary historical writing? Well, yes, I sort of think it is. And this is a question that we will come to tomorrow, because obviously we're looking at life writing tomorrow. I think the way in which an autobiography is different from a memoir is that an autobiography implies thinking about the trajectory of a life. So if I'm writing my autobiography, and this is a point I shall make again tomorrow, if I'm thinking, okay, I shall write my autobiography, I'm quite an ancient person now, so why not an autobiography? So I wouldn't just sit down and start scribbling. I would think, so, you know, how did things lead on from my childhood to my years as a student, to my early professional years? Then there was my family came along, and then travels. So what is what, if I can call it, what is the narrative arc? By that I mean the story, the thing with the beginning, the middle, and not yet, I hope, the end. Does that make sense, Nabila? An autobiography, the story of a life, implies a story with a beginning, a middle, and something approaching towards the end, at least the end of the life as it has been lived to date. Whereas a memoir is, I think, a more general term. It doesn't necessarily imply a whole life construction. You know, a memoir of my time in Peru. I'm not telling the story of my life. I'm just recounting some interesting things that I saw that happened to me during those years of my life. So that would be the difference between the two English terms, autobiography and memoir. But of course, the other thing that you would want to bear in mind, and if this is a genre that you're particularly interested in, what are the local language terms for those for a life story? So Banarsi Das, our Jain merchant, called his life story, it was a half-life story. I've only written about half my life, but he called it a katha, a story. The Jahangir Nama, which we translate as the memoirs of Jahangir, Nama, of course, is a Persian word for history. We want to bear in mind both the vernacular equivalent, what is the vernacular being used, and when we're looking at English terms, we want to bear in mind the special category of the autobiography, because it implies that it's the whole story of a life, the beginning, the middle, and the end. I hope, Nabila, that helps you. So who else can we...
Thank you so much.
No mention. Who else can we take up now?
There's a question from Tanya here.
Tanya.
Right at the bottom.
Tanya, hello, thank you for this. How should we approach history too, in order not just to make use of it as a tool of an academic writing? Well, so that's a good question. When we continue to give precedence to history too for universal theories or literary frameworks, well, I think perhaps I need to clarify a little bit. I don't see, although I see history two as a resource for history one, and indeed history one should be a resource for history two, I don't in any way think of history two as something that can be a tool. you know, a tool implies something that you take up for your own purposes. You're not interested in it other than for the ways in which it achieves your own immediate purposes, and then afterwards you set it aside. What I've tried to convey is more like a respectful conversation between the two. That history one, although its practices, some of its practices and concerns are different, history, any good practitioner of history one should understand that history two offers it enormous resources, enormously important questions, and that this should be a conversation. This should be a mutually respectful engagement, if that is possible. So I'm not at all saying that I'm not positing the hierarchy that I think your question suggests, that history one has regard for the facts, history one is the professional, and we take up history two when it suits our purposes. No, I mean, it's more a conversation where both sides have a great deal to gain, that I hope we can promote. Certainly history one doesn't anymore think in terms of universal theories. We think in terms of, I mean, this is what postcolonial perspectives teach us that we can't do. We used to think we could put up these universal theories about the great direction of the historical process. And we don't believe that anymore, because history has taught us that what we think is permanent, immutable, the next day we're looking at it in the rear wing mirror. I hope that makes sense to you, Tanya. So I'm coming on now to Hansa Rawat. How can you use vernacular literatures, regional literary works as compelling sources? Well, so again, I think this comes back to things which we've touched on before. You don't want to go into them thinking, okay, what are the facts in here? I'm looking at this for facts. I'm looking at it, is it reliable? Rather, the historian wants to look at much more, you know, what we do is we don't begin so much with our questions. We begin with the author. Here we have this writer of a literary work. What was he or she in his own context trying to do? First of all, let me understand that. Understanding, so, you know, if we take the example of our author, our Gujarati author, Mehta, trying to understand, you know, as Mira Asha so powerfully makes clear, understanding what Mehta was trying to do tells us all sorts of things about the period, about the society, about the people that would have recognized what was in those Mehta's work, about how Gujarati was developing as a literary language, about the political agendas of the day. And none of that means reading Mehta to say, okay, what in here did he get right and what did he get wrong? How reliable is he? Those are not the questions, if we're historians, those are not the questions primarily that we want to ask about literary sources. We want to ask about the context in which we're written. We want to ask about the audiences for them. Of course, sometimes, you know, if we're looking for something, if we're looking at a process or an institution, a community, where we're really struggling to find evidence, literature may there be a help, and we may then look at a work of literature for a fact or facts. But we would only ever use that, as it were, draw on that, if there was some corroboration from some other source. And then when we pick that up for our own analysis, We would, of course, say this comes from a literary account. It's likely to have its own political literary agenda, so we have to bear that in mind. But for what it's worth, I offer it to you, the reader, as a possible corroboration, because I see similar things corroborated elsewhere in other sources. Do you see? I hope that makes clear, Hansa. So, we don't want to wade in there into a literary text and say, what did they get right here then? That's not. I think we need to ask that question, but it's perhaps not the first question for us to ask. Now, is there? I'm just keen to keep a watch for anyone who hasn't asked a question before.
There's a question from Tukaram, who's unable to raise his hand, and he has messaged.
Tukaram, namaskar. Where is your question?
Let's just check. Tukaram, can you unmute yourselves? Okay, maybe we can take another question and then.
I heard Tukaram. Can you?
Hello. हॅलो मॅम. माझा प्रश्न असा आहे की आता मी स्पेशली म्हणजे डॉक्टर बाबा आढाव जे कामगार चळवळींवरती काम केलंय त्यांनी अनऑर्गनाइज लेबर मुवमेंट वरती, त्यांच्यावरती मी PhD साठी अभ्यास करतोय. तर आता माझ्यासारख्या नव्याने अभ्यास करणाऱ्या मुलाने काय म्हणजे इतिहास संशोधन करत असताना काय जबाबदाऱ्या किंवा काय खबरदारी घेतली पाहिजे, किंवा व्यक्तिकेंद्री इतिहास होऊ नये, किंवा एखाद्या व्यक्तीने केलेल्या कामावरती आपण जेव्हा लिखाण करतोय तर काय म्हणजे काय काळजी घेतली पाहिजे असं.
So, Sagar, I think I understood your question. We may need help from Professor Kumbhojkar. You mentioned that you have started to work with Dr. Baba Adhav, and you're embarking on a new research project, and you're curious about what sorts of things are important to remember. What are your responsibilities? May I say, Mr. Naik, may I humbly ask you, the next time you see Dr. Adhav, please would you convey the very warm regards of Professor O'Hanlon to him, because when I was a raw junior research student in 1979, all those years back, he was very helpful to me. And I've always remembered his help and been grateful, as well as admiring the great work that he does for the labor movement in Pune. So my reply is really, you've asked a big question. Mota prashna hai. Kai tumsa zababdari kai. Well, my answer is that your first priority is to listen. By listening, I mean to read, to conduct interviews, if that's part of your, if you're looking at a more modern period, so that you are not jumping to conclusions. I have emphasized the importance of conversation. I've emphasized the importance of, if we're interested in a particular historical figure, and of course there are so many figures connected with the Satyashodak Samaj that haven't really been investigated. If you're interested in a historical figure, the first thing to do is try to understand them on their own terms. Look at them in their own context. Why were they saying what they were? And if you make that thought about context and understanding that these are the contexts in which these activists were working, then that will be a very good start for you. Professor Shraddha, there may be parts of the question of Mr. Naik's question that I haven't answered, that I didn't quite understand.
This was indeed Tukaram, and he tells me that his computer got hanged or something. So he joined from Sagar's phone. But you have, Professor O'Hanlon, I'm really grateful to you. You have answered his question. He was asking about the responsibility of a young researcher. And he was asking how one can avoid being a fan of a historical persona such as Dr. Baba Adao himself. So he's working on the contribution made by Dr. Adao.
Oh, is he really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
how can one avoid that?
Let me say something else. In my time, I have felt, this guy Fuller, he was remarkable. Aren't I lucky to be working on him? What a fantastic bloke. And, as historians, if we're working on a particular figure, naturally we choose people that we admire. There are very few exceptions to that. Why would you work on someone that you find really rather awful? I mean, of course, there are terrible tyrants that people work on, and that's because they're terrible tyrants. But broadly speaking, as historians, if we choose an individual figure, then we like them, and that's why we've chosen them, and that's fine. But really, to do them full justice, we need to move beyond our own element of hero worship, and really to try to understand them in their own context, to give them that degree of respect. Because after all, what matters is not us. After all, they are what's important. So to give full respect to our subjects of investigation, that's the question that we want to ask, to set our own, admiration aside. There is also, I think, another important principle, if I can just dwell on this for a moment. If you are working on a particular individual, now sometimes you can come, particularly if you're working on someone who's alive or whose family is alive, what do you do if you find yourself having to say things that possibly they might disagree with? That's not the reason I did that, or that the family might not like. How dare you say that about our illustrious family member? Well, the family is one thing, and we have to, we're very often dependent on families, of families that have in their possession sources. So we have to proceed very cautiously and with great humility, and as far as possible with transparency. When it comes to the way in which we write about people who are alive, we may find ourselves thinking, well, he or she says that's why she did that, but I don't really believe it. I think there was something else going on. Of course, our duty is, in the end, to tell the historical truth as we have attempted to work it out, using all of our best endeavors. But if the subject of our history, for me, it's a fundamental principle that the subject of our history should be able to recognize themselves in there. And if they don't recognize themselves, then you're doing something wrong, in my eyes. They should, they might say, well, yes, you've certainly done it, as we say, warts and all, showing the full reality. But they should recognize themselves. And if they don't, then I think you need to go back again and look at how you're working.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Naik, for lending your connection. Now, let's look at other things. Now, who hasn't asked a question?
Shreya Nikam from YouTube.
Shreya, namaskar. Was there an attempt to know the history of Indian regional languages? Well, as you will imagine, India's regional languages have a very long and very distinguished history. With the arrival of print in the middle of the 19th century, of course, those languages, the vernacular languages, changed, because to have a print language, you need to have a grammar, a fixed grammar. You need to have a fixed script. Then you can have print. And so that's one stage in the development of vernacular languages that historians have focused on. The area of research I think that is most interesting at the moment is looking at India's regional languages before print, when many people had access at least to two languages, when there was no fixity of print or grammar or spelling or punctuation. It was a very fluid world in which a scribe might would if you wanted a copy of a manuscript, a slide might say, well, I'll charge you 2 rupees per page, and he'll sit down and write it out for you very quickly. So there were lots of manuscripts circulating, but it was a very different world. And I think the reason that it's an interesting world is that so often we think about regional languages in their their modern form has been there forever. But in fact, their modern form as print languages is a very recent arrival. And we need to bear in mind the things that came with that. That, you know, this was very enabling for many people. It was very limiting for others. I hope that gives you some answer, Shreya, there on YouTube. Thank you. Now, others.
Before her, I think there's a question from Niyati, who hasn't asked a question.
Acha, Niyati, thank you for your question. Elaborate on the material frameworks through which Phule and other intellectuals of the time were engaging with History 1, such as the Aryan invasion theory of Max Muller. Well, so how does
networks, I think she's talking.
engaging with the History 1, with the networks, is that?
Material networks.
Yeah, the material networks. Well, two things. Of course, Max Muller in his time would no doubt have thought of himself as practicing very accurate, very evidence-based history. And he was drawing his evidences from language. You know, in those days, you know, there are no archives surviving from that very remote period. So scholars of the day thought that if you look at language and you look at how language has evolved, that will shine a light onto the broader history of that community. So up to a point, that's true. But Max Muller drew all kinds of deductions from it, like the idea that there is an Aryan race, which we would now regard as something a bit more like history too, because there is, you know, it's using a concept which we now recognize as a very ideologically charged concept, race, which we would reject. So the question is, it's still an important question, how would Phule have come across these works? Well, these were the leading bits, you know, this was big news. at the time. We forget, we perhaps forget, how important print culture was at the time, how important newspapers were. Foullé was reading, if not Max Müller himself, and I'm fairly sure he would have read Max Müller. He had access to missionary libraries, who of course would have had copies of Müller's work. Foullé was reading about the history of the war in the United States. Foullé was reading about the history of slavery in the United States. He was reading about Afro-American intellectuals of the kind that he dedicated Ghulam Giri to. So I think we need to, yesterday I spoke of the way in which Indian intellectuals had very good access to the materials about their own histories. We need to bear in mind that they also had pretty good access to a lot of the most influential sociological works of the day. So I hope that helps your question there, Niyati.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Probably he read it in a missionary library. So where should we go next now? Shraddha, I wonder. Anyone? Something from Prabhuddha?
Yes, there was a question from Prabhuddha also.
Prabhuddha, hello. In the last few years, Vedic literature, particularly the Ramayana and Mahabharata, have been used as sources of history, the study of history. So how should we understand them as sources? Well, I think I would give you the same answer that I've given to other similar questions. How can we see literature as a source? Well, of course, the Ramayana, both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, relate to a very distant, very, very remote times in Indian history, where we don't have any other evidence from that period. So my question would be rather, what sorts of things can the Ramayana and the Mahabharata tell us as historians? How can we learn from them? And well, the first thing we can learn from them is how different generations of poets, bards, shastris, scholars, how they have worked on producing different, what we call recensions, different renderings of these texts. At what point did there come into being something like a stable, widely accepted version of these texts? And usually that is a question that you can answer. If you go around all the libraries that you can find and look at versions of these two texts and all of the fragments of these two texts, because of course, normally we don't find the Mahabharata present as a whole Mahabharata, we find particular chapters of it when we're looking at manuscripts. So one thing we can learn is at what point did a stable textual tradition emerge? At what point in history was that? Can we date that? Then we might be interested in how versions of these two texts have disseminated in regional vernacular culture, in regional vernacular manuscripts. So again, you can go around and look at how these texts were rendered in different regional languages, and did they say the same? Did they simply translate literally, or did they give them kind of local flavorings? So these great classics also had their own local lives in particular regional languages. Then we can look for ways in which particular recensions, ways in which these texts, from what we can judge, suddenly became popular at particular periods of history. Suddenly, for some reason, we find loads and loads of manuscripts being produced at a particular historical period. The great scholar of Sanskrit, Sheldon Pollock, has a theory about how there was a sort of burgeoning of interest in these great classics with the Turkic invasions into southern India during the 14th century. You know, he says these, if you look at the versions of those manuscripts that were written then, you can see some sense of the concerns of contemporaries who are trying to reassert their own traditions of kingship against the armies of the Delhi Sultanate states. So again, I come back to the point that when we're looking at literature, we don't very often go into literature as historians. We don't very often see it primarily as a reservoir of facts. We're interested in the contexts in which it was written or rewritten. We're interested in how it's circulated. We're interested in what its audiences can tell us. Sometimes we may look at particular works of literature for information, for empirical information, but we would only use that really if we can corroborate it from other sources too. Prabuddha, I hope that is a useful reply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Now, what about Gauri, others?
Gauri Desai.
Gauri, Bola. We have seen in India regional histories are not studied in detail, in as much detail as that of any imperial authority. Is that because of the importance given to History 1 over History 2? Well, I think well, partly it depends on, you know, what kind of history are people trying to write. If you're trying to write a textbook for school students or a textbook for beginner university students, then of course you write an all India history. So that might be a history of the Mughal Empire, it might be a history of the British Empire. But once you move beyond that, once your audience as a historian is really other historians, other scholarly, other people, other historians or other audiences with an interest in regions, then of course you write regional history. And so I'm not sure that I completely agree that regional histories aren't to the fore in India. In fact, you know, I'm a sort of walking embodiment of the fact that now we all write regional histories. Of course, we try to set them in a broader context, but I see regional histories as a genre that is very alive and vibrant. And of course, history too, very often it's a genre that is particularly enriched by history too. So if I can slightly rephrase your question, Gauri, I think it much depends on what kind of history you're looking at. But if you're interested, if you're thinking, why don't I come across more regional histories, then it's out there to look at if you want, as and when your interests move in that direction. Thank you, Gauri. I hope that's helpful. Tamana, if I can ask you, address your question. Let me see. Well, I mean, this is a very big question. Of course, history too, that's to say nationalist history, if you like, overtly nationalist histories, enormously affected the anti-colonial struggle. I mean, history writing was a very powerful, and not just national history, but regional histories were a very powerful factor in during the nationalist era. you've only to look at the fact that all those historians who went round collecting history in old documents in Marathi in the early part of the 20th century were also ardent nationalists. In what manner did the anti-colonial struggle affect? Well, in what way did the partition of India affect history too? Well, I mean, that is such a big question that, I mean, the partition of India recreates the entire arena for history too. And of course, you know, as I indicated, I think in my second lecture, India's partition, both for India and Pakistan, have made all sorts of questions now very difficult to ask. For obvious reasons. For Pakistan, any question that the partition of India didn't have to happen would be seen as a kind of national insult. After all, the very raison d'etre of your state comes out of that event, and your own understanding of the older history is the two-nation theory. There have always been two nations in India, and partition was simply a recognition of that fact when one nation, a second nation, came out and stood alongside the first nation, stood alongside the nation of India. So, of course, for Pakistan, it resets the agenda of national history writing entirely. And of course, for India, I mean, India, in terms of partition, we are taught these days to think of partition not just as a kind of one-off event, but an ongoing story about nationhood, about the relationship of nations to their citizens, an ongoing story about national boundaries, because of course, the national boundaries of India, particularly with what was at first East Pakistan, were not set in 1947. They were set after, of course, after the war that brought Bangladesh into existence. And those boundaries are still not set now. We have these flows of population across those boundaries, which cause a great deal of suffering locally and very challenging problems for both governments. So I think that is a question, you know, of course, Fanon's work is a very good one, and he's absolutely right to say that literature and culture are, as well as history, are enormously important tools in the fight against colonialism. So it's good to have his work mentioned there. Thank you, Tamana. Kshitiji, please ask. Go ahead. Oh yes, no, sorry, I should be reading the chat box, shouldn't I? Just one moment. Can the lyrics of songs be seen as literature and sources of history? Yes, absolutely. They are certainly literature, and they are certainly sources of history. You know, they are sources for the reasons, in the same way that the other kinds of source, of literary source and history have something to tell us. When songs talk about societal problems, of course, if those songs are telling us about societal problems where we have very few other evidences, then we might say, yes, that this is valuable empirical evidence, but we would also work very hard to try and corroborate it from other sources. But primarily, we would want, if we're looking at songs, we would primarily, again, not go into those songs for facts. Primarily, we would say, well, okay, are we looking here at songs that are sung in the present? Are we looking here at songs that have come down to us via some printed version? In both cases, let us ask, how did those songs come into being? How did the tradition of those, were songs, you know, was there a professional bard, a professional community of bards who made their living by going around and singing these songs to patrons? How were the songs handed down? Were there little potis? Were there little wahis in which the songs were written that would be passed down from one bard to another? What were the audiences? Who gathered to hear them? Did the songs have any written form at all? Normally, most songs have some written form, and then the question is, when were the songs first written down? Are the songs still in the course of fresh ones with new words being sung? So those are the sorts of questions, Chitiji, which I think you would want to ask about songs, rather than, okay, what facts can I find in them? Although you might also want to ask that question too. So let's move on down. Anyone else? Have we had a Krishna? Okay, Krishna, thank you very much for this question. Just give me a moment to read it. I know Rawat's work, very nice chap. Colonial knowledge, that colonial knowledge stereotyped Chamars as traditional leather workers, etc., criminalized them as cattle poisoners. How can we deal with these arguments about colonial knowledge? Well, I mean, does that mean that this colonial knowledge about Chamars is tainted? Yes, of course it is. Of course, colonial officials liked to think about nothing more than categories. You know, what category can we put this person into? That's how they like to think. And the reason that they liked to think about it was because in part because they saw themselves as having an enormous task of government, and they felt that they wanted to do it in an organized way. So first thing is to put people into categories. So caste was very convenient for them. Everybody belongs to a caste. We can work out how this society works if we just work out what caste people belong to. So of course, there are all these wrong assumptions building up, so that colonial knowledge about untouchable communities, as we used to call them, would come to contain these stereotypes. And what do we do with them? Well, my suggestion, of course, suggestion here is that depending on what era you're working on, there are many, many other sources about Chamars, other than, you know, the census reports or reports about criminal tribes or reports about cattle poisoners. There are many, many other reports, other sources of information and evidence about Chamar communities. Those evidences are there for the later 18th century in legal cases. They're there in the Peshwa Daftar, and quite quickly they are there in the social movements that caste communities like the Chamars were launching by the middle of the 19th century. So those would always be the sources that I would look to before I went to a colonial census report or a gazetteer. I mean, it's a great shame. The gazetteers, and you will all be familiar, many of you will be familiar with colonial gazetteers, they're full of information, but I've never found them useful because the information is taken out of context. You don't know where it's come from. It's generalizing. Sometimes you get a little bit of information about a particular temple or a particular form of landholding, but mainly the anthropological information in there, I've simply never found useful. It's all too taken out of context. So I'm very sympathetic to your suggestion about colonial knowledge as being deeply tainted. Although we should also remember that sometimes you do find dissident voices in that colonial knowledge in the way that I described earlier. Are there other kinds of knowledge or other kinds of discourse, such as a Brahmanical discourse? Yes, of course there are. I mean, quite what you would mean. You could mean a number of things. You could mean simply Brahmanical religion, the idea of the best thing in life as being dharma, and our guide to dharma being in the Dharma Shastra, and our guide to how we should live being varnashram dharma, the orders of caste, the orders of your life, life stages. Those are a form of Brahmanical discourse. But then there are many other and later forms. Something that I'm doing a little bit of work on at the moment, which kind of comes out of my work on Brahmin family communities, Brahmin diplomatic families, and the Brahmin Kulavratans. Something that I'm looking at the moment is there is a whole body of literature, really from the 1880s through into the 1930s, and that's about as far as I've got, which is it is all Marathi literature. These are Brahmanical critiques of the Satyashodhak Samaj. Why it's wrong, why, some of these people are wicked, some are just misguided. How can we prove that they're wrong? And I don't think anybody has really looked at this. And I think, because I think these currents of thought fed into the founding of the RSS in 1925, I think this is a history of critique which we need to know about. So I would also call that a form of discourse. It's a moment at which conventional conservative Brahmin intellectuals are thinking, these are very serious critiques of the whole principle on which we live our lives, and we need to answer them. So they're kind of trawling around looking for ways of countering the Bahujan critique, the Satyashodhak critique. So that is another kind of Brahmanical discourse. And of course, by this time, there are journals called Brahman, which are full of articles like this. But I think it's very interesting the way that it feeds into conservative politics. So that's a little side thing that I have going on now. I hope that's helpful, Krishna. Now, how are we doing? I don't know whether there's anyone else who hasn't sort of asked a question. Just looking back through my list as I went through my list, thinking, looking at everybody's interests. Just bear with me. We had such excellent applications for this course. It was very difficult to make the selection of different amongst the different students. Anyway, let's see if there are. Here we are. Anne-Marie, if there's time, I would like to leave a comment on Fule's slavery. Please, Tanya, if there's a question that you'd like to ask, we rather moved over that bit a little bit quickly, perhaps. Is there something that you'd like to say or to add in the chat box?
Yes. Should I just type it down or should I say it?
Try and say it, Anne-Marie. We'll tell you if you type it.
Okay. So the thing is, it's a similar story that's said in Fule's slavery. There is a similar story in Kerala regarding Onam. It's just a bit different in terms of it's the same characters, but it's just that there was no war or anything. It's just that Mahabali was a very generous person, and it goes like that. But then I found it interesting on the argument or the statement that you had made regarding how these should be seen more of as a political call, because for a very long time, the image of Mahabali was shown to be more in context of a Brahmanical person. And recently, after the Dalit movements have come up in Kerala, the image of Mahabali was questioned, and they started bringing up the image of Mahabali to be more in terms of a Dalit person. So I found it interesting when I was going through it. So I thought I should just add it. That's it.
How very interesting, Anne-Marie. I mean, that just shows how these kind of icons from the past are open to appropriation from, you know, you mentioned the figure of Bali as being at one time appropriated or thought to be in some way Brahmanical, now in some way thought to be a Dalit. Of course, you know, these are political agendas of the present day. But what I think is interesting about these forms of appropriation are the ways in which the agents, the activists doing this, how do they populate their story? What are the sociological details? What are the historical details that they call on to make the figure meaningful in the present? You know, we've seen how Phule, so persuasively related the figure of Baliraj to his own culture, to his own sociology. And that's what I think we'd be looking for, because it's that rich, it's that texture which brings history 1 and history 2 together. That's where the potential for conversations are. I don't know if that makes sense, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
Well, so probably that's it for today, if that's okay with you, Professor Amanda.
Right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for bearing with a very long session. I've, you know, as with the other sessions, I've really, really enjoyed it. And I do thank you all very much indeed for your most active participation and for the really good questions that you've been asking. It's a help to me to have to think about it and to think about it from new perspectives. I look forward to our final day, look forward very much to our final day tomorrow.
If I may chip in a bit, then today was a day when many of our own history department students have asked questions regarding their own work. So we have Chitej and Krishna and Tukaram. They've been working towards their MA dissertations and some towards their PhD as well. So I'm really, really grateful that this bridge, this academic network it seems to be building up. Thank you so much, Professor Ohandle.
Not at all. Thanks are due really to all of you. And see you tomorrow for our last meeting for the time being.
At 3 p.m.